Today I'm speaking with the Social Democrat and former Bundestag President Wolfgang Thierse. Thank you very much for agreeing to this DW interview.
Of course.
And a warm welcome to our viewers. My name is Thomas Spahn. Mr. Thierse, in the election to Germany's parliament, the Bundestag, the right-wing populist AfD won more votes from Eastern Germany than any other party. How does that make you feel as an Eastern German who has fought against right-wing extremism for years?
It's an appalling result that makes me very sad. But we shouldn't speak only of the Eastern Germans. The difference between East and West to the AfD is relative. The AfD has also grown very strong in Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, 12%, and even more in Eastern Germany.
Everywhere in Eastern Germany.
That's right. And first, we must say something obvious. The voters themselves are always to blame. They carry the responsibility for whom they elect. And voters in Germany could know whom they were voting for, because the AfD is already represented in a number of state parliaments, especially in Eastern Germany, where it's done nothing constructive, just made hate speeches. The party is fragmented. But that didn't interest the voters. Obviously, they wanted to vent their anger, their disappointment, and their protest. And that's why they went for the AfD.
Isn't it a little too simple to say the voters are to blame? Don't the democratic parties, including the Social Democrats, bear some of the blame that the AfD has entered several state parliaments?
I'm merely saying that it's become customary to excuse the voters and to drip with sympathy when speaking of people who know very well what they're doing, have voted for a party that oscillates between conservative, right-wing populist, right-wing extremist, and racist. And we can't exonerate them. Then we have to talk about what they're angry and disappointed about.
We should do that.
And that brings us to the many problems we face. First, in Eastern Germany, the severity and radicality of the experience of upheaval, of experienced or feared unemployment. Also a feeling of disadvantage, because living conditions in East and West are not equal. And I don't say this as a reproach. It's merely a sober reality. But there's more to it. It's also a problem everywhere in Germany and in Europe. The election of right-wing populists expresses a fear of change, fears of being alienated from one's homeland, in the face of dramatic changes we call globalization, open borders, refugee immigration, many things that unsettle, anger, and outrage people, and lead them to articulate these fears. And that brings them to the right-wing extremists, the right-wing populists.
Basically, refugee policy and dissatisfaction with refugee policy has made AfD strong. Let me ask about the other party's responsibility again. It has long been foreseeable that there would be this counter-movement and wave. Did the established parties simply concur for too long with Chancellor Angela Merkel's solitary decisions?
That would be too simple, because then we'd have to talk about the alternative. I'll say it again. Of course, the fear of refugees is an important motive. But it's interesting that far fewer foreigners live in Eastern Germany and far fewer refugees have arrived there, and yet support for the AfD is so strong. There's no direct correlation. There's an indirect connection. And I've called that fear of change, fear of loss, fear of alienation from one's country. The worry that what people are familiar with will be lost, a deep feeling of insecurity, although many people are doing quite well materially. When we see so many AfD voters in Dresden, in Bautzen, and in Görlitz, and we see at the same time how good these cities look and that a lot of good things have happened in the last 25 years, but it's unjustly distributed, and not everyone is equally happy about it. People's subjective judgment of their situation contradicts the objective situation of many people. Let me explicitly note once again that we're not talking about a specifically German or Eastern German problem, because right-wing populist parties are succeeding all over Europe, in France, Belgium, Holland, Italy, Poland, and elsewhere. So the challenge clearly has to do with the dramatic changes we call globalization, the end of boundaries in the world, the acceleration of development. Even digitalization, which we now talk about and which has begun, makes people feel insecure. No one knows how our economy and industry will change or what people's working biographies will look like. Will this technological progress lead to more unemployment? We're in the middle of a phase of dramatic change that creates insecurity all over the world, in Europe and also in Germany and Eastern Germany.
You were a president of the Bundestag. Let's talk about the office, task and challenge of the Bundestag president, now that there are right-wing extremists, right-wing populists in Parliament. What does the Bundestag president face? What would Wolfgang Schäuble do in a plenary session if, for example, Alexander Gauland says, "We'll hunt down Mrs. Merkel"?
It's a tightrope walk. The Bundestag's rules, the rules of order, but also the rules of parliamentary decency, apply to everyone equally. We shouldn't focus especially on the AfD, but enforce the rules equally on all. And that's a duty of the President's office, and the President in particular. We have to ensure that the Bundestag and the German public don't jump through every hoop and react to every provocation. That merely gains the AfD attention. At the same time, we must also contradict them and apply the sanctioning tools. There aren't many of them. When suddenly the attempt is made in Parliament to paralyze parliamentary work through endless debates on the rules of order, or when things disintegrate into name-calling and racist utterances. In such a case, the President and his office must use the instruments from warning through reprimand to exclusion from the session, or even from a longer period of sessions.
You said you shouldn't jump through every hoop. Do I understand you to mean that you are against the Bundestag altering its rules of order so that an AfD speaker, as senior president, doesn't preside when the new Bundestag opens? Would that be a trick you would oppose?
That happened a half a year ago, and the background is very understandable. People were worried that the new Bundestag would be opened by a speaker from the AfD who was a professed Holocaust denier. The German parliament didn't want to give this public worldwide impression. I understand the motive very well, and we'll always have to pay attention and not accept everything the AfD does just because they were elected. Being elected does not justify political swinishness, to put it bluntly.
You say, don't respond to every provocation, but consider very carefully where one intervenes. How should the federal president respond to provocations disguised as expressions of opinion? For example, when one praises the role of Germany's Wehrmacht in World War II or questions Germany's relationship to Israel.
The point is to contradict the substance of such utterances. That's the task of all the other democratic parties, to contradict them very decisively, very soberly, and very clearly, and thereby say to the citizens and to the German and the world public, this is the position of extreme outsiders who are represented in Parliament, but who cannot claim to be able to win a majority in Germany in any way. That will be one of the tasks in Parliament, to always show publicly what can garner a majority, what the basic democratic consensus is that keeps this republic, this democracy afloat, and what lies far outside the consensus.
Now, a broad discussion is beginning among the parties about changing Germany's immigration policy. Is this a great opportunity to take the wind out of the AfD's sails?
We have to remember that after Chancellor Merkel's decision to open the borders, she later changed refugee policy herself. Basically, she rescinded her own statement, "We'll let them all in," by making great efforts to close the borders again.
In cooperation with the Social Democrats?
Yes. I'm merely saying to close the borders. I believe all the Democratic parties agree that immigration must be limited and regulated. The Social Democrat Party, for example, presented a draft bill on immigration half a year ago. Initially, the Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union rejected it. We'll see what agreements come out of the coalition negotiations, but we'll have to regulate things. We have to clearly distinguish between the subsidiary right to asylum, to temporary refuge for people fleeing war, and regulated legal immigration to Germany. This task has been clear for quite some time. So far, it's failed because of the CDU and CSU, but we have to address it now, and I'm fairly sure we will succeed.
Mr. Thierse, we always conclude our talk with our 3 incomplete sentences and request that you finish them. The danger that the right-wing populist AfDs voted into the next Bundestag as well?
Can't be ruled out. It depends on how democratic people act.
In the opposition, my Social Democrat Party?
We'll have to work hard to avoid remaining in the opposition over long term and become capable of governing again.
Until the Berlin Wall has fallen in the minds of Eastern and Western Germans, it will still take...
The wall is gone. There are lots of differences. West and East, North and South, young and old, city and country, rich and poor. We shouldn't keep speaking retrospectively of this wall in people's minds. It's really not that bad, despite all the differences.
Wolfgang Thierse, thank you very much for this talk.
You're welcome.